and welcome to episode 2 of Compound Influence. I'm one of your co-hosts, Zack Miller from Tearsheet, and joining me is Josh Liggett, analyst extraordinaire. Welcome, Josh.
Analyst, you know what? Because of what we're talking about today, I will take analyst extraordinaire as such a compliment, Mr. Miller.
That's a great segue, because we're going to be talking about Ron Shevlin. We're calling him the expert or the analysts. And as we'll talk about who Ron is and how we unpack the mechanics of influence around what he does, we're also going to compare him to Jim Cramer, who we spoke about in our first episode, and what makes them so different, right?
I think this is a good contrast. We went with Cramer last week because you got to talk about Jim Cramer because he's Jim Cramer.
The OG.
Ron Shevlin is, I would say, is pretty much on the opposite side of the spectrum as Jim Cramer, but very powerful in what he does and the platform that he's built and the following that he's built, which to many people is as probably more powerful than what Jim Cramer has already put together. But depends who you ask, which is super important to the context that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think when we were trying to prioritize who we wanted to speak about, which influencers to talk about on the show, Jim Cramer was the obvious first one because he's the OG. And I asked for Ron to be added to this one. Josh, he wasn't somebody you knew were intimately familiar with. Ron's an analyst. He works for Cornerstone Research. He's the head of research there, and he is all about analyzing the inner workings of banking, mostly retail banking. He talks about credit unions. He also has this mode about him where he takes a contrarian approach. He calls it snark, but he kind of has a nice way of looking at accepted practice, accepted understanding of things, and using data can poke a hole in it and say, actually, the way everyone's looking at this thing, it's not really there. The business isn't where you think it is. It's actually over there, and here's why. And I think that approach, done in a non-theatrical way, is a very powerful one for the financial industry.
Absolutely, and I wasn't familiar with Ron. I started reading him a bunch after we spoke about him, before the podcast. We put everything together of doing this. It definitely resonates a lot with me with the way the values that I have and how I like to do my research when I'm looking at a new company or looking at new industry. And I've to see, this is another one of those guys, so to speak, which there isn't. Well, I think there is actually probably only one Jim Cramer. Arguably, there's not many others who are similar to him. There's many others who are in a similar vibe to Ron Shevlin. Maybe nuanced a little bit differently in other ways, but they come about with a certain style, a certain persona, a certain way about them, which is very specific to finance, which I think we can talk about a little later, nuance and getting into those differences. I think you could see it even more contrasting the clip we played last week of Jim Cramer screaming about the global financial crisis versus Ron talking about something at a conference.
Yeah. So one of the things about Ron is that he is an expert in this field. Like going back to his role at Forrester in '97, he was at Forrester from '97 to 2006. This is somebody that is intimately familiar with the inner workings of banking, and it comes through in everything that he writes. Instant credibility, and I think that's really interesting. We have a little clip we'd like to share. I thought now would be a good time to roll it. I am going to do that.
A driver of decision of who they do business with, and that is continuing to diminish decade over decade. Why? Has nothing to do with technology, the internet, or mobile devices. It has to do with the fact that after World War II, as we became a more affluent society, our creditworthiness improved, and we had more needs for savings and investments. So what happened was rates and fees became a much more important driver of decision for products and providers. In fact, it got to the point that around 2000 or so, we had a lot of conflict in the industry. I talked to a lot of banks and credit unions who say, we don't compete on rates and fees. We compete on the quality of our service. It's simply not that easy. You have to compete somewhat on rates and fees. If you think you compete on rates and don't compete on rates and fees, then go charge 15% for a mortgage and see how much business you get.
I like that clip. So you see, not a lot of flair there. I mean, there's no theatrics. And, instead of talking about this and this is going back to 2015, by the way, instead of talking about, and I might be guilty, our reporters might be guilty of this at Tearsheet as well, of just saying like, well, because of technology, the branch network is ultimate, an ultimate downturn. He ties it back to actually like the macroeconomic theory and how the U.S. has changed, since World War II, with that focus on fees and stuff like that. So like that's not that. There's a nuance there that you really have to be like really really deep in the weeds to understand and to appreciate.
When he was up there talking, it sounded like a professor getting up there, laying down groundwork. First of all, he looks like a professor. That's a guy who's sits behind a desk. That's he's wearing. I think the clip was 2014. He's not wearing flashy clothing. He's buttoned up. He's got a tie. Versus what we had last week with Cramer with his body flying all over the place, or with what you see with a lot of tech launch.
Yes.
No sleeves rolled up. He's not wearing a T-shirt with a sport jacket. He's old school, and I'm going to give it to you, like a professor. The fact that he was talking about banking in 2014 and he was talking about World War II is crazy. That's not what an influencer do, because influencers aren't about like, oh, let me take you back, 70, 80 years, to talk about something that you weren't even alive for. It's more about quick getting that, how can I get it something in 10, 20 seconds or a short form content, whatever it is. Ron is building up a thesis, building up an idea based on information, based on data, laying that out, and then contradicting what everybody else in the market is saying, which is, for somebody who's loves an analysis, loves getting my hands dirty in companies and markets. I love that, and I thrive for that. The problem is, when you're talking about like mainstream people, is most people don't want to be educated financially, which is something that definitely on the consumer side, and most people don't have the patience for that. But for people who are in the trenches, who really live finance and live investing, or live trying to develop new products, or trying to work on something new, this is like a beautiful symphony to them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's in contrast to Jim Cramer, who was short form Twitter. We said, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of tweets he's done over the years. Ron is building a thesis. He's not contradicting himself the day after like a trader. He's building a thesis, like you said, Josh. He's continuing to build upon that and go deeper with it until the time comes where he's got another idea and heads in a different direction. It's very methodical, and it's very planned out, and it's very impactful. I learn a lot from listening to Ron, and I know our writers do as well. And he writes stories like, I'll give you one example. Like in the Zeitgeist a couple years ago, everybody started getting excited about the metaverse, and JP Morgan Chase opened up a branch in the metaverse. We've talked about this over the years, Josh. So it takes Ron to write a story about, should banking consider metaverse solutions a priority? And in the title, he says, I'm going to say no, right? Like, so, okay, we sort of all knew that it was ridiculous, but, he added his gravitas to the story and said, this is, what a waste of time when you don't have product delivery in the real world down, and you're not really communicating with Gen Z, the way you could be. Like, to focus on the metaverse just seems like so almost antithetical to what a bank can actually deliver to its customers. So other stories, if the U.S. bans TikTok, where will Gen Z go for financial advice?
Zach, I want to jump in on that one.
Yeah.
Because so over the weekend, I was with people. I was talking with somebody who's helps people with just their day-to-day finances, get them, from the black and the red, in many instances. And I mentioned like this guy, Ron Shevlin, like, who is that person? They didn't know them. He wrote an article about, if the U.S. bans TikTok, what happens with all the, where do Gen Zers go for financial advice? And they laughed for a second and said, that's a great point. And that's like, those types of articles is like, oh, yeah, really intriguing. And not only that, when you read the article, it's not based on emotion. Because many people could talk about the emotional side of, oh, TikTok this, TikTok that, and come to a conclusion on what we should be doing about TikTok, and say the word should a lot. this should be happening, oh, this is going to be perfect, speaking from like an ivory tower and saying how the world's going to be. He's like, so in the article, Ron starts with the data. He's like, listen, this is the reality. The reality is that people do this. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? He doesn't even like take a side. He just lays it out what is on TikTok. Like, hey, it's a lot of people with these, get rich quick scams, and which aren't necessarily good. That's most of it, but not necessarily taking a side, but stating a problem, which is you do this and there's going to be a butterfly effect, which could be problematic. And just that approach is so intriguing to people who value that, what I like to call boring finance. Mm-hmm. And you and I disagree on this. I can tell you that I've been to conferences on many occasions where I've been moderating panels, across Europe, in the US, and I've said my dream is to have a panel and run a panel which is called Boring Fintech Runs the World and Boring Finance Runs the World. That this is the mode that you call it boring, I call it interesting. So to me it's a term of endearment for the financial world when you have somebody that's more boring or doesn't have the pomp and circumstance or the pageantry of buttons all over the place to hit or fireworks or giving away Lamborghinis. Raw data, raw information, to me, is the most, compelling part of finance.
I appreciate that, Josh. And I agree with you. I mean, being boring, what you would describe as boring, is table stakes, is to be able to gain trust and access in the industry. So it's super important. And we always talked about how, trust is what sells in finance, and that can take decades. It can take hundreds of years, like some of the largest banks, and can be eroded relatively quickly too. So I want to move into pulling apart the attributes that make Ron Shevlin so powerful as an influencer. The first one I wanted to bring up was his independence. He's a very friendly guy, and he's connected to a lot of people. And you notice when he posts on LinkedIn, he'll get a lot of feedback and people sharing and commenting on what he's doing. When I say a lot, it's a lot for our field. Maybe it's 10 or 20 comments, which is a very popular post in our industry. There's not really a way to influence him. He's independent. Independent. You can't really befriend him in that sense. Which means, he sort of has that buy side mentality where it's he's not shilling anything. He's not trying to sell you on anything. He's got this gravitas to him that makes it feel like, he's sort of above all that all. He can engage in the conversation, but at the end of the day, he stands on his own 2 feet. And I think that's important. I think that's really important. It's something, you can talk a little bit more about this because you have a lot more experience on Forbes than I do, but his number one place where he posts content is on Forbes and on LinkedIn. His Twitter numbers, to get back into the weekly segment of Josh by the Numbers, he's got around 48,000 Twitter followers. I think 41,000 Twitter followers, but 48,000 posts, which is hilarious. But more interesting, he's got 8,000 people that he follows. Whereas Jim Cramer only has 600 people, where a lot of people who are influencers want to keep that number really, really, really low. They want to make it seem like they're so much more powerful than they are. He's not gaming anything, Ron. Yeah.
No, he's and he's reposting people all over the place like crazy because hey, this is interesting, that is interesting, which to a lot of people, to me at least, that many people, including me, believe that's what Twitter and social media is about, is that exchanging, that reposting, that retweeting, that conversation back and forth, which is what you alluded to, which is what he gets into. But what I've seen in my time of reading Forbes articles and reading content online is it's all sponsored content. Let's be real. You're all trying to sell something.
They built a contributor network. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the purpose. We all know why we're here. We're all here so that there's always a call to action, whether it's at the bottom or the top or somewhere in that Forbes article.
If it's free, you're the product. Yeah.
Correct. The more you focus on delivering an interesting message, the more it will resonate with people. When I've done my research, or I've been looking at markets or companies, whatever, especially in newer markets where you have startups, coming out with their marketing team, putting out tons of blog posts, it can get so shilly and so just get out of here, come on. That is a big turnoff, and people don't like it, and it doesn't work. Where someone like Ron's like, listen, I'm gonna say something really interesting because I think it's interesting, and I'm gonna put something together that's snarky, to play on the title of his blog, whatever you call it. Sorry. And at the very, very bottom, I'm going to put a little call to action, or I'm not even going to have to put a call to action because you're going to find it so interesting and you're going to come chase me. And that's really, that's I think what he's been built on Forbes in the correct way that many people do mistakenly, where they focus so much on selling themselves than putting out an interesting product.
Yeah, so just to drive home the value of using Forbes as a distribution strategy, in the last company I started, Our Crowd, where Josh was also an investor, I became a Forbes contributor, and I used it as a way to talk about some of our portfolio companies. And I wrote an article at one point, this is going back like 2014 maybe, on disability technology. We had invested in a few companies that were in that space, and I did a listicle. And I don't know, a few months later, I got an email from the National Health Institute of Australia saying, we've done all of our research online, and you are an expert in disability technology. Will you come and address our panel, which was deciding what drugs and technologies to include in the insurance basket for that year? And I'm like, I wrote one article on the subject, and somehow I was seen publicly as an expert in the space, which it clearly wasn't. I just helped to organize the information together for an article. Anyway, it drives home the power of Forbes, because even though you're right, Josh, like it is shilly, that contributor network opened it up. So there's definitely articles of different quality in there and different motivations, but is still seen for a business reader as like, well, if it's on Forbes, it's got some quality. I'm going to ascribe like some value to that. And so I experienced that personally. I always thought that was a funny story. I came home and told my kids, I spoke to the government in Australia today about disability technology. They didn't pay me either. That's so if you're out there listening,
did you speak?
You should pay your advisors, huh? What?
Did you speak at the end?
We spoke. Yeah, I had an hour long.
No, did you show up? I'm saying.
Oh no, it was a Zoom call. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, but we did have an hour long.
It would be great if you had an actual.
That would have been.
It'd be great if you actually flew out to Australia based on that.
To talk about my history and experience with disability tech, which was puddle thin. But anyways, Forbes is still one of a handful of publications, a branded publication that has that cachet with it. I do believe that. One of the things, Josh, I know that you mentioned to me when we were talking about Ron Shevlin was, sort of the complexity, and whether you're going to call it boring or not, but like the very nuanced articles he's writing that don't actually appeal to a broad range of readers. Like I think you found one called "Achieving High Performance Lending: The Impact of AI on Lending Efficiency." Right, like that's a pretty heavy title, but it does what it says it does. And for somebody that's in that space, that's going to be an important article.
Zach, that article sounds so interesting to me. That's what I'm saying. To me, that is so interesting. Like I didn't have time because I found that like pretty recently before we started recording. But I'm looking forward to like spending a good hour, 2 hours reading a 30-page article about AI and lending, which is something that I've been in the startup world with my background of being in the as an operator dealing with factoring and seeing AI come and impact factoring. Yeah, this is something that resonates hardcore with me. It is fascinating to me. But to 99, if I show that to my wife or my dad or my mom or everybody else in my on my street, they're going to look at me like I have four eyes. And what are you talking about? So I think that sort of leads to an interesting point within fintech and finance that's different than most other markets out there, which is it's such a big market that you can be niche, and the TAM is still ginormous. When I look at a fintech company in the startup side, I joke around that you don't need a TAM slide. Like it's obviously big enough. I think maybe like the only time I've ever been in a situation where I was a little bit concerned on the TAM was like software for hedge funds for generating secondary alpha. it was like we had to get like way out in the weeds, nuanced and crazy for it to be like, okay, and even then it was like, maybe there is a market for this, we're not sure yet. Which, if ever, in anything, in most other markets, you get out of here. Talking about the banked world, talking about the unbanked world, the underbanked world, the fact that every business needs to get paid, the fact that everybody needs to manage finances, the fact that there's transactions going out there, every day that need to happen, the fact that the amount of money that's moving around the world every day means that the market's so big, you can say, you know what, I'm going to cover this tiny little niche and I'm going to do my thing, and it's going to be big enough to make a nice living out of, and have that piece of pie that's big enough. He's dealing with credit unions, which you love. Again, only found that now I know why you wanted to include him on the list, was because I know how much you have an affinity for credit unions. But talking credit unions, smaller banks, doesn't need to deal with the larger huge players in the world, because market's big enough. And it's not only that, within that subset, it's big enough to deal with somebody who's can't be bought off, like you said, and is going to give it to you straight, and is not worried how you feel. And that's really, that's really interesting, and something that's unique to finance, and something that Ron has been able to capitalize on impressively.
I want to also bring up a point about Ron's brand of influence. Clearly, he takes a strong opinion, and we've spoken about that, you and I, Josh, on this episode. But in that strong opinion, there's a vulnerability, and I think that is really, because he could be wrong. He definitely encourages people to take the counter position to where he is. He wants to have an academic debate. He wants to have an open debate, an open conversation around these things. There is that level of professor, I think, that you said, Josh. But in doing that, there is a vulnerability in the sense of saying, he could be wrong, or the trends could move against him, or he's not just towing the line between, just kind of a mush opinion. He's taking a side, and I think I appreciate that, because I think that there's a certain level of authenticity in that I'm attracted to as a reader. I love the fact that he's coming with an opinion, is open to hearing other things, and ultimately may change his mind based on feedback. And my experience with other influencers is they're on broadcast mode, and it's not necessarily like that kind of ongoing conversation.
I think with other influencers, you either get the hardcore, just like bells and whistles and give away Lamborghinis and whatever it is, or you get contrarian just to be different and say something crazy.
To stand out.
Because I want attention. Mm-hmm. It's hard to toe that middle where you're like, it's going to be with intent. I think that's the word that is the correct word. The content is going to come with intent, but at the same time, I'm not going to do something for clicks, clickbaity, likes, whatever it is. Even though to me, the title, if you ban TikTok videos in the US, where will Gen Zers go for investment advice? To me, that's a clickbaity title, a little bit. But at the same time, it's not, because that's the actual piece. It's not like, what's normal clickbaity is something crazy and then there's no payoff. Him, it's like, I came up with a really interesting article. I came up with a really interesting idea. It might be interesting because I'm a little out there, and I'm willing to take a little bit of risk, but I'm going to come with intent, and I'm going to show you that this is actually a real problem and a real issue. And I think that balance is sort of exclusive to finance. And there's a few people here and there that do it very well, and it's something that is something that I appreciate tremendously.
I like that, and in Ron's defense, it may be that on Forbes that they may tweak his headlines after he publishes.
It's a great headline.
At that level, I think Forbes has a light editorial touch, and so let's end on this point that you just sort of introduced, Josh, which was this storytelling. It's B2B storytelling using data, using nuance. It is one of the new ways to build companies online, where you're seeing not just marketing people, but the CEOs and founders of companies be able to go onto LinkedIn and have an ongoing narrative. There are all these challenges to post every day or every other day, for 3 months or whatever it is. But they're opening up the curtain to peer behind them as individuals, as entrepreneurs, as leaders, or their company mechanics, and you can learn a lot from them. One of the best examples I see doing that is retention.com's Adam Robinson. He's got about 100,000 followers on LinkedIn. He debates the doubters. Like he'll have a webinar with somebody that comes out and speaks, very strongly against him. He talks shit about himself. Like he'll show where he messed up and kind of how he's fallible or he's a megalomaniac. Like he has an ability to self-reflect. And he shares a lot about his entrepreneurship journey and building his company. And for somebody who's looking to move into like that space of marketing, online marketing, like you can learn a lot from him through the storytelling. Imad Akun, who's the founder of Mercury and CEO of the neobank Mercury, which is sort of like Silicon Valley Bank 2.0. He does a great job of this too, and his voice has grown over the past year or two. Where maybe it was in light of the SVB collapse, like he kind of emerged as a leader online, and he's sharing, action letters that are coming from regulators, or there was this Synapse whole snafu that was happening there about one of the main banking as a service companies failing, and the impact that had across the industry. Like he's emerged as recently they shut down some accounts. In some of like more riskier geographies, they basically said the compliance cost wasn't worth maintaining anymore, but people were upset. And he came online and talked about it and what that decision meant. He even cut off people from Pakistan, which he was native from. And like, I'm sure that was not an easy decision for him. But so he's taking the company building online, and for a fintech founder that's looking for a bank, he's got a persona, and Mercury's got a persona online where I can connect with before I even bank there. And like, it's filling me with trust and with empathy, and that would be the first place I would think of banking nowadays, as opposed to a faceless bank that doesn't have that type of presence online.
To your point, and to build upon it, Zach, it's also that people, more consumers than businesses, but to a certain extent businesses, want to see how the sausage is made a little bit, and want a little,
it's like tasting before you buy, in a way.
Yeah, they want to know sort of like what's going on there a little bit, like how is this happening? What is the company like? What's the culture like? I think those are, you have that a lot with sustainable, like what are the values associated with a company, which has been definitely on the consumer side. On the business side, it's more of building trust and building relationships, especially something I've seen as, operating a business in the early 2000s, and then seeing my parents that had a successful clothing company in the US in the 80s and 90s, and seeing the transition away from relationships to numbers, where if you're informed, it used to be that you go to a bank, and you get or your business, you want to get a line of credit, you have a conversation, it's built on trust. Now it's, are you in formula, are you non-formula? It's looking at a table and, using AI, to Ron's point, to help make those decisions, making the decision less human and more, not necessarily happy for that relationship, makes it more difficult, but more computerized and more just objective, which is good, but you lose that personal take when it comes to business. So I think there is, just like people with Cramer, just like people will always want to trade specific stocks, I think even CEOs of companies want to know a little bit, especially smaller ones. Larger ones is something totally different, but CEOs of budding fintech companies and smaller companies want to know a little bit more about who they're working with and want that a bit of personal. They understand it ain't going back to the 80s and, where it was, pretty fast and loose out there with everything. But there is a middle ground where it's still very much computerized and very much objective, but there is something that, we can figure out how to smooth the edges a little bit. And I think that being able to storytell around your business can really help bridge that gap and provide that additional trust and personalization that a lot of small businesses, startups, budding, fintechs are really looking for.
Very well said, Josh. I think we're near the end of our conversation today. Always great to talk to you about influence and the mechanics of influence within financial services. This was episode 2, focusing on Ron Shevlin. Thanks. Great to talk to you, Josh.
Zach, always a pleasure, and have a good rest of the day.